At the dawn of December 8, 1941, only hours after the surprise Japanese attack on the United States Navy ships anchored in the base at Pearl Harbor, 13 dive bombers and 9 fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy took off from aircraft carrier Ryujo and embarked on their 150-kilometer-long journey, hoping to repeat the same success as their comrades did over Hawaii. This small formation was only a spearhead of the much larger attack force, and their target was the Pearl of the Orient, an American Commonwealth in the Far East, the Philippines. Positioned approximately 800 kilometers off mainland Asia, the Philippine archipelago extends some 1,850 kilometers almost due north and south from Formosa to Borneo, strategically situated in the geographic heart of the Far East, providing an ideal stepping stone for further expansion to Borneo, New Guinea, and deeper into the Pacific, while at the same time can act as the protective barrier against any potential invasion of the East China coast, French Indochina, or the Dutch East Indies. Out of the more than 7,000 known islands and islets that make up the Philippines, just 11 cover more than 94% of the archipelago's total land area, and the largest and most important of them is Luzon in the north, with next in size Mindanao in the south, followed by the islands in the central group, the Visayas, Samar, Negros, Panay, Leyte, Cebu, Mindoro, and others. These islands are largely covered in mountains that reach as high as 3,000 meters and make up to 65% of the archipelago's total land surface, with narrow coastal plains, numerous short, swift-running streams, and only a few rivers. In May 1898, the United States gained control over the Philippines after seizing the archipelago from Spain during the Spanish-American War, and the early years of American rule were plagued by tension and hostilities that ultimately resulted in the bloody Philippine insurrection. Following this turbulent period, the normalization of American-Philippine relations came in 1916, when the U.S. administration granted the Philippines limited autonomy, and in 1935, the United States Congress voted to make the Philippines a Commonwealth, guaranteeing them full independence by 1946 after a 10-year transition period. The same year, Manuel Quezon won the presidential elections, becoming head of the government of the entire Philippines. And one of the first problems the newly established Commonwealth government seriously dealt with was the organization of the armed forces and the provisions for the archipelago's defense. To supervise the creation of the new Philippine Army, Quezon turned for help to his old friend, former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, soon to retire General Douglas MacArthur, appointing him as the military advisor to the new government with the rank of Field Marshal. In October 1935, MacArthur, together with 2 U.S. Army majors, James Ord and then unknown Dwight Eisenhower, whom he selected as his principal assistants, arrived in Manila to prepare a plan to provide the Philippine Commonwealth with a system of national security by 1946, the year when the islands would gain independence. As he didn't want the future Philippine government burdened with a costly professional army, MacArthur intended to organize the future Philippine Army based on a small regular force of no more than 10,000 men and a conscription system to build up a reserve contingent organized in divisions of approximately 7,500 men that, once mobilized, could reach the expected strength of 400,000 men by the middle of 1946. However, as 1941 drew to a close, the dark clouds of war began to gather over the Far East as the growing tensions between the United States and Japan came on the verge of escalating into a full-scale conflict, forcing MacArthur to accelerate the implementation of his plans. From September 1, 1941, the Philippine Army began mobilization of 10 reserve divisions, and by the eve of the Japanese attack, the estimated total Philippine Army strength was about 120,000 men, including the troops of the 1st Regular Division. Such a rapid expansion of the armed forces brought numerous challenges and problems, and in December 1941, not a single mobilized division was at full strength, whereas the general condition of the Philippine Army was poor. Many drafted soldiers had only basic training, and discipline in most units was far from desired, while plenty of Filipino officers and NCOs were equally untrained, with little or no knowledge of tactics, causing American officers to assume command of battalions and higher formations as the war progressed. Furthermore, the language barrier presented another significant challenge. As the Philippines was home to multiple languages and dialects, so many Filipinos found it impossible to understand not just American officers, but each other. To make matters even worse, the Philippine Army suffered from chronic shortages of almost all types of equipment. Some men thus lacked fundamental personal equipment like helmets, boots, entrenching tools, or even uniforms. Moreover, although the Philippine Army had an adequate supply of Enfield and Springfield rifles, they were low on automatic weapons, machine guns, and most importantly, artillery and other heavy weapons, while motorized transport was virtually non-existent. Alongside the regular Philippine Army, by December 1941, some 22,532 troops of the United States Army were stationed in the archipelago, with nearly half of them being Philippine Scouts, a well-trained, motivated and reliable fighting force made up of Filipinos enlisted in the U.S. Army. The bulk of U.S. Army ground forces were grouped into the Philippine Division, commanded by Major General Jonathan M. Wainwright, which consisted of 3 infantry regiments and supporting units, with 2 regiments, made up of Philippine Scouts, and only the 31st Regiment composed entirely of Americans. Another substantial American contingent included the units of the harbor defenses that operated coastal artillery, mostly high-caliber howitzers, and some anti-aircraft artillery, protecting the port of Manila, the capital of the Philippines, and airfields in the vicinity. The Philippine archipelago also served as the base for the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Fleet under Admiral Thomas C. Hart, which included the fleet's flagship, heavy cruiser USS Houston, 2 light cruisers, 13 old destroyers, 17 submarines, and a variety of other smaller vessels based in ports of Manila and Olongapo in Subic Bay. The Navy's air elements consisted of 24 Catalina patrol aircraft. Also, a part of the Asiatic Fleet was the 4th Marine Regiment stationed in Shanghai. In late November, Marines, with attached naval personnel and some civilian refugees, were evacuated to the Philippines, where they arrived by December 1st and were assigned the mission of guarding the naval stations on Luzon. In the meantime, following a total embargo of all raw materials, including oil to Japan, imposed by the United States after the Japanese occupation of French Indochina in the summer of 1941, in parallel with diplomatic negotiations, in utmost secrecy, both sides began preparations for war, and as the possibility of war in the Far East grew too real to be ignored, the United States made all efforts to protect its exposed outpost in the Far East. Therefore, the first action taken by the United States War Department regarding the strengthening of the defenses of the Philippines was to unite the American and Philippine units in the archipelago under a single command. So, on July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt recalled by then already retired MacArthur to active duty in the U.S. Army, granting him the temporary rank of Lieutenant General and appointing him commander of the entire Philippine garrison, which now had been put together into a newly formed Army-sized unit designated as United States Army Forces in the Far East. Upon taking command over all land forces in the Philippines, MacArthur promptly began preparations for the archipelago's defense, restrained in his efforts by pre-existing plans for the defense of the Philippine Islands in the event of war with Japan, prepared during an interwar period, known as War Plan Orange. The most recent revision from April 1941, designated as War Plan Orange 3, was incorporated into the Rainbow 5 set of war plans that focused on the United States strategy in the event of war with Germany, implying that any defense of the Philippines would have to rely on existing forces with no prospect of immediate reinforcement. Assuming that Manila would be a primary Japanese objective, a detailed approach of Orange 3 called for the Philippine garrison to concentrate all its forces in central Luzon to protect the capital, with the ultimate mission to deny them entrance to Manila Bay, until the Pacific Fleet fight its way through within 6 months period with sufficient reinforcements that would enable the defenders to push the Japanese out. Should Japanese pressure become unbearable, the defenders would withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula, where they would set up the base with sufficient supplies to sustain a prolonged siege until help arrived. Bataan Peninsula, covered in jungle and with harsh mountain terrain favorable for defense, was not randomly selected as a last stand by Warplan Orange 3, since only a few kilometers from its southern coast lie several small islands turned by the Americans into fortresses that commanded the entrance to Manila Bay, with the largest of which was Corregidor Island, also known as the Rock. The fortification of these islands began during Spanish rule, and from the moment the United States gained control over the Philippines, they initiated a vast construction program, completing Fort Mills by 1914 and turning Corregidor into a formidable stronghold with 23 coastal artillery batteries and a total of 56 high-caliber guns. In addition to heavy guns, the island was self-sufficient, with its own power plant, water wells and desalination facility, a railroad, airfield, and most importantly, 23 tunnels dug into the solid rock of Malinta Hill that housed office spaces, hospitals, and barracks large enough to comfortably accommodate a garrison of some 6,000 personnel, and with storage area large enough to store 6 months' stock of supplies, which later could be transferred to defenders on Bataan Peninsula. But still, MacArthur wasn't pleased with Warplan Orange 3, which he deemed overly defeatist, and insisted on more active defense, aiming to protect the coast and attack the Japanese while landing on the beaches when, as he believed, they would be most vulnerable. He based his optimism on assuming that due to weather conditions, the Japanese invasion would not take place until April 1942, and by then, he would have sufficient time to train his growing army and construct a proper beach defense to prevent the Japanese from establishing a foothold on the archipelago. However, to do so, he had to disperse his seemingly strong forces to protect the vast Philippine coastline. In order to push his changes to the plan and gain greater autonomy in organizing defense, MacArthur used his influence and connections in the War Department, and by the end of September, his efforts paid off. Therefore, he had split his army into 4 major tactical commands of an average strength as those of the Army Corps, the strongest of which was the North Luzon Force, under the former commander of the Philippine Division, General Wainwright, consisting of the 11th, 21st, and 31st Philippine Army Divisions, and the 26th Cavalry Regiment, composed of Philippine Scouts, and despite being the regiment by name, the unit had the approximate strength of a battalion. Also added as a reserve to the North Luzon Force was the 71st Philippine Division, but it could be committed only upon MacArthur's command. Wainwright's force was assigned to hold the most critical sector of the Philippines, North and Central Luzon's plains area, Lingayen Gulf, and withdrawal paths to the Bataan Peninsula. The South Luzon Force, under Brigadier General George M. Parker, Jr., composed of the 1st Regular, the 41st and 51st Philippine Army Divisions, was assigned to the area generally south and east of Manila to protect the airfields in its sector and prevent potential Japanese landings. The Visayan Mindanao Force, under Brigadier General William F. Sharp, formed of the 61st, 81st, and 101st Philippine Divisions, was scattered all over the rest of the archipelago, with the primary mission to guard the airfields in the Visayas and prevent raids rather than fighting a full-scale invasion. The American Division and the 91st Philippine Division made a 4th force and were to remain in reserve in Manila under the direct control of the Far East Army's headquarters. Additional troops were promised to the Corps commanders once they arrived from the United States or were mobilized by the Philippine Army, as by April 1942, MacArthur expected to have about 200,000 well-trained troops in the Philippines, heavily reinforced by men and equipment sent directly from the United States. And his optimism was well justified. As the war with Japan became inevitable, the War Department didn't want to give up the possibility of establishing an effective defense of the Philippines as being of great strategic relevance as a barrier to prevent Japanese domination of the Western Pacific, so they decided to give the highest priority to supplying the Philippine garrison with all kinds of military equipment, especially anti-aircraft artillery, modern combat planes, and tanks. By the end of September, the first contingent arrived from the United States, consisting of the 200th Coast Artillery Regiment for anti-aircraft protection and the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions, with some M3 half-tracks, armed with 75mm cannons and 108 M3 Stuart tanks that formed the Provisional Tank Group attached to the Philippine Division, and which proved more than a match to Japanese light and even medium tanks. More reinforcements and supplies were to be shipped from the United States in the upcoming months, scheduled to arrive at the beginning of 1942, including more than 20,000 men, 8,000 vehicles of all types, various artillery and other weapons, tons of ammunition and other equipment. But due to outbreak of war, those precious shipments never reached the Philippines. However, the most crucial reinforcement that began arriving in the Philippines in the summer of 1941, and MacArthur's first line of defense, on which he relied the most, was about 277 aircraft of Far East Air Force under Major General Louis Brereton, which included 35 of the Army's new long-range heavy bomber B-17, better known by the famous name the Flying Fortress, along with 107 P-40 fighters and many other obsolete bombers, observation, transport, and trainer aircraft. These fighters and bombers, based on airfields of Iba, Nichols, Del Carmen, and Clark Field, were supposed to attack the Japanese invasion force while still on the sea and prevent any landings before they began or even launched the bombing raid on troop concentrations and shipping in Formosa. This growing force indeed presented a serious threat to the Japanese, and by March 1942, the War Department planned to have 165 heavy bombers in the Philippines. Despite increased efforts for strengthening the defense and numerous reinforcements, many in Washington were still skeptical about the prospect of holding the Philippines. The naval officers in particular were aware that to reach the Philippines, almost entirely surrounded by the Japanese bases in the Caroline, Marianas, and Marshall Islands, which stretched across the Central Pacific and disrupted the lines of communication with the United States, the Pacific Fleet would, instead of 6 months, as predicted by War Plan Orange 3, require at least 2 years to fight its way across the Pacific and to reach the isolated archipelago, or otherwise would come at the risk of being destroyed. Moreover, some preliminary analyses suggested the Japanese could land up to 60,000 men on the Philippines within a week, and this force could grow to the strength of about 300,000 within a month. These predictions proved, however, to be exaggerated. As the negotiations with Washington were going nowhere, Japan, unwilling to accept American terms, decided to embark on a risky campaign, while being capable of committing only limited ground forces for this endeavor. Therefore, in early September 1941, Emperor Hirohito authorized his army's plans for war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. As a result, the attack on the Philippines was only an important segment of a much greater Japanese offensive plan aimed at taking entire Southeast Asia, a region rich in raw materials and oil, which was to commence with simultaneous attacks on Malaya, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies, immediately after the neutralization of the greatest threat to the Japanese advance, the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. For this task, the Imperial Japanese Army gathered 11 divisions, grouped in the Southern Army Group, further divided into 4 armies, of which the 14th Army, under Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu, stationed in Formosa, was assigned for the invasion and occupation of the Philippines. The 14th Army consisted of only 2 divisions, the 16th and 48th, each with approximately 20,000 personnel, and the 65th Independent Mixed Brigade. Although this force might seem modest, the Japanese army had some advantages over its opponents, since the Japanese soldiers were highly motivated, disciplined, and well-trained, and most importantly, they were experienced veterans who fought in China and knew how to react in combat situations and operate under fire, even in small groups. The air support was to be provided by the 4th and 24th Air Force Brigades of the 5th Air Group under Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata. In addition, the Imperial Navy also assigned the 11th Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, based on the airfields on Formosa, as these naval aircraft had a longer operational range than the armies and could reach targets in central Luzon, including the main American bases at Clark Field and Manila. So combined air and naval strength committed to the Philippine campaign was about 500 combat aircraft. The naval element assigned to support the invasion of the Philippines consisted of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral Ibo Takahashi, mainly an amphibious force with supporting cruisers and destroyers. considering that the bulk of the Japanese fleet, including almost all large aircraft carriers, was assigned to the attack on Pearl Harbor for the assault against the southern Philippines, which was out of range of land-based aircraft stationed on Formosa. The Imperial Japanese Navy was able to allocate only the light carrier Ryujo as part of Southern Covering Force. Still, in the early stage of preparing a broader strategy for the offensive of Southeast Asia, the Japanese High Command recognized the strategic significance of the Philippine Islands, fully aware that any prospect of retaining occupied areas in the south would be endangered from the left flank if the archipelago remained in American hands, and as a result, they placed great emphasis on occupying the Philippines in order to create a strong defensive perimeter around the newly acquired southern area. The detailed plan focused on neutralizing American air and naval forces in the Philippines, identified by preliminary intelligence analyses to pose the greatest threat to the invasion, so it called for simultaneous air attacks against American air and naval installations on the island to gain air superiority and create favorable conditions for a ground invasion. The attack was to begin on the first day of the war, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, while in parallel with airstrikes, small Army and Navy assault units were to land on Bataan Island, about halfway from Formosa to Luzon, and 3 places in North Luzon, Apari, Vigan, and Legazpi, to take the airfields in the vicinity. Right after these airfields were secured, the main force of the 5th Air Group was to move there and provide close air support to the main invasion force of the 14th Army. With air supremacy gained over the islands, the 48th Division, reinforced with 2 tank regiments and 1 infantry regiment from the 16th Division, was to land along Lingayen Gulf, north of Manila, while in the meantime, the remaining 2 regiments of the 16th Division would land at Layman Bay, southeast of the capital. The 14th Army would then advance on Manila from the 2 directions, expecting the decisive engagement of the campaign to take place there. Meanwhile, the elements of the 56th Division, stationed on Palau Islands, were to land in southern Mindanao and take Davao and the nearby airfield to establish a base for further expansion south. The narrow timetable of broader Japanese plans gave General Masaharu only 50 days to seize Luzon, and afterwards, the 48th Division and most of the air units were to be redeployed further south where needed. Then, the 65th Brigade was to mop up the remaining resistance and assume garrison duty on Luzon, while the 16th Division was to proceed south to occupy the Visayas and Mindanao. In late November, the first warnings began arriving at the Asiatic Fleet headquarters, stating that Japanese troop movements indicated a surprise aggressive movement in any direction, including an attack on the Philippines or Guam, and on November 27th, a final alert went out to Hawaii and the Philippines, with even stronger message: negotiations with Japan have ceased, and an aggressive move by Japan is expected. Immediately on receipt of these warnings, MacArthur ordered the Philippine garrison to prepare for a Japanese attack, and with the first days of December, the men of the Philippine garrison began to move promptly to their assigned positions on beach defense, without knowing that their fate would be sealed in a few days by the events that would take place some 9,000 kilometers away. On the west side of the international dateline, the war in the Pacific began on December 8, 1941, when, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese land, naval and air forces launched almost simultaneous attacks on Malaya, Thailand, Guam, Hong Kong, and Wake Island. At dawn on the same day, the first air raid on the Philippines was to commence, and it was still pitch-dark night when Japanese Army and Navy pilots climbed their fully armed planes, ready to take off for Luzon, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a dense and heavy fog appeared, blanketing airfields and initiating a chain of events that would ultimately result in a disaster. Given the time zone difference between Hawaii and Formosa, the Japanese already had to wait a few hours before taking off and then had to fly a few more to reach the Philippines by daylight, so the fog that dragged on disrupted the extremely narrow timetable. Therefore, this unforeseen development filled the Japanese with anxiety and fear that instead of being the attackers, they would end up being attacked, and their worries were not without foundation. At 2:30 a.m. on December 8th, While many in the Philippines were still asleep, the first news about the bombing of Pearl Harbor came to the United States Asiatic Fleet headquarters in Manila, but no one notified MacArthur or any other Army officer. About half an hour later, Army Signal Corps operators intercepted a commercial radio transmission with the news about the surprise Japanese attack on Hawaii. MacArthur learned about the outbreak of war at around 3:30, when he was awakened in his penthouse apartment in the Manila Hotel by a phone call from his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Richard Sutherland. About 15 minutes later, Sutherland called General Louis Brereton, a Far East Air Force commander, at his quarters, and Brereton reacted promptly, so before he left for MacArthur's headquarters to ask permission to launch an attack on the Japanese bases on Formosa, he alerted his Air Force units and ordered them to prepare for action. At 5 a.m., Brereton arrived in Manila, where he met Sutherland, who informed him that MacArthur was in a conference and told him to prepare his bombers for the mission, but not to initiate any action without MacArthur's order. Without getting what he came for, Brereton departed Manila and returned to his headquarters at Nielsen Field, and while the precious time quickly went by with no response from MacArthur, 2 hours later, he returned to Manila for a second time that morning. But again, he could not get past Sutherland to discuss the matter directly with MacArthur. In a heated debate, Sutherland has told already frustrated Brereton what best can be summarized as to go ahead with preparations, but don't shoot until you're fired upon, also requesting from him to acquire fresh reconnaissance information about targets on Formosa, even though since early December, both sides had already carried out some reconnaissance flights above each other's territory. And, while they were arguing, the first Japanese bombs fell on the Philippines when the bombers and fighters from aircraft carrier Ryujo arrived over Davao on Mindanao and began bombing and strafing the airfield in the vicinity and seaplanes in Malalag Bay, inflicting some minor damage at the cost of 4 planes. Upon returning to Nielsen Field, agitated Brereton received a telephone call from General Henry Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Force, who told him to do whatever was necessary to prevent a recurrence of the disaster that happened at Pearl Harbor, and not to allow his planes to get caught on the ground. Brereton assured him that he would take all precautions to prevent that from happening in the Philippines, and as the first warnings about approaching Japanese aircraft began arriving from the radar station at Iba to his headquarters, Brereton had no other choice but to cancel preparations for the bombing of Formosa, so at about 8 a.m., he ordered his planes to take off and look for safety in the air. A few minutes later, the first planes of Far East Air Force roared down the runways, and while the fighters were to patrol over the airfields to provide air cover ready to intercept the Japanese, the airworthy heavy bombers, in the meantime, were to fly without their bombs south and circle there until they were ordered to get back and land. Meanwhile, at 7:50 a.m., the fog over Formosa finally lifted, so after hours of tense anticipation, Japanese aircraft hastily began to take off, bringing relief to many pilots once in the air, even though they knew that by this point the Americans were already alerted and waiting, making the surprise they had hoped to achieve now impossible to pull off. Somewhere around 9:30 a.m., the lead squadrons with 25 twin-engine Imperial Japanese Army bombers appeared over the Philippines and struck the airfield at Tuguegarao, some 100 kilometers inland from Luzon's northern coast, while at about the same time, another flight of 17 bombers attacked Baguio, where President Quezon's summer residence was. After completing their bomb run, the Japanese bombers headed back to Formosa without any bombers suffering any damage during the attack, nor having sighted a single American aircraft. At 10 a.m., Brereton had made yet another unsuccessful call to MacArthur, but again he couldn't get beyond Sutherland. But this time, only 15 minutes later, MacArthur called him back, granting him the complete freedom to, at his own decision, attack Formosa later in the afternoon. Yet, in a post-war press release, General MacArthur said, "General Brereton never recommended an attack on Formosa to me, and I know nothing of such a recommendation having been made," further adding that an attack on Formosa by his small bomber force, without fighter support, which because of the great distance involved was impossible, would have had no chance of success. Nevertheless, regardless of contradictory post-war statements and blurred memories, the truth is that, after the attacks on Baguio and Tuguegarao, and once the Japanese aircraft had headed home, Far East Air Force Headquarters issued an all-clear report, so from 11 a.m., American bombers and fighters started landing to refuel and rearm for the upcoming bombing raid against targets on Formosa, and by 11:30 a.m., nearly all the planes were back at their bases, just as the second wave, this time with nearly 200 land-based Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, were getting near to northern tip of Luzon. At approximately the same time, this large Japanese formation was detected by a radar station at Iba, accurately predicting that this force divided into two groups was heading towards the main Far East Air Force bases at Iba and Clark Field, and immediately a warning message went out to the control room at headquarters in Nielsen Field, and order to scramble fighters went out to all airfields on Luzon. However, due to disrupted radio lines, this message has never reached the base at Clark Field, where refueling and arming were in full swing. Instantly, upon receiving orders at 11:45 a.m., P-40 fighters that stood ready to scramble at bases at Iba and Nielsen quickly took off and dispersed to cover Clark Field, the Manila area, the Bataan Peninsula, and intercept a reported Japanese formation over the South China Sea. Meanwhile, at Clark Field, fighters had just finished refueling at 12:15 p.m. and were prepared to take off when the first flight of Japanese planes, consisting of 27 twin-engine bombers, appeared over the airfield. While the Japanese pilots lined up for the bomb run, they could not believe the sight they saw, as below them on the field lay American heavy bombers perfectly lined up, wingtip to wingtip, refueling and loading bombs while the fighters were taxiing to the runway, getting ready to take off. And rather than having to fight their way through the expected swarms of American fighters, they encountered an almost unprotected airfield, finding themselves in conditions that resembled more like training than a combat mission, offering them an opportunity that was too good to be missed. Thus, after being delayed by the fog for such a long time, and within less than 24 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Naval Air Force managed to achieve yet another complete tactical surprise. And, just as the air raid warning sounded over Clark Field, at about 12:35, the first flight launched the attack, targeting hangars and buildings below, closely followed by a second similar formation that attacked the aircraft on the ground, including P-40 fighters that were blasted by bombs as they attempted to get into the air. When all 54 bombers had completed their perfectly executed bomb run, 34 Zero fighter planes came to deliver the final blow with their low-level strafing attacks on the grounded B-17s and the P-40s with their tanks full of gasoline. The attack lasted for about 1 hour, and against it, the Americans could offer little opposition as the modest anti-aircraft defense experienced considerable difficulties with old stock of ammunition, along with other issues often accompanying the sudden transition from peacetime to war, while hundreds of explosions reduced Clark Field Base into rubble, covering the field with a heavy cloud of dense smoke. And once the Japanese headed for home, they left behind almost all American planes destroyed or damaged, as well as 55 Filipino and American ground crews killed and more than 100 wounded. Simultaneously with the raid against Clark Field, 54 Japanese twin-engine naval bombers, escorted by 50 Zeros, struck the airfield at Iba. However, here they have run on the 12 American fighters coming back from a patrol over the China Sea, which have instantly become engaged in wild dogfights against Zeros, keeping them busy and preventing them from carrying out the low-level attacks that were so successful at Clark. But despite effective defense by the P-40s, which resulted in the destruction of 2 Japanese fighters, the final losses at Iba were almost as great as at Clark, with nearly all barracks, hangars, warehouses, equipment, as well as a radar station, destroyed, while ground crews suffered heavy casualties, and with nearly all P-40s stationed there were destroyed or heavily damaged. Against all odds, the Japanese air attack caught nearly all American planes on the ground, which allowed them to, in a single day, repeat the same success as in Pearl Harbor. On the first day of the war, the Far East Air Force had lost half of its strength and ceased to be an effective fighting force. Out of its original 35 B-17s, only 17 remained operational, while the fighter force, out of 107 aircraft, suffered 53 P-40s and 3 P-35s destroyed. In addition, The Japanese have destroyed an additional 25 or 30 obsolete bombers, observation, training, and transport aircraft, while many of the planes listed as operational were heavily damaged. Most installations at Eber and Clark Field had been damaged beyond repair, and the total casualties for the day were 80 killed and 150 wounded, while only 7 Japanese Zeros failed to return to Formosa. To make matters worse, the annihilation of the Far East Air Force might have been avoided, as one part of the defensive plan, prepared in case of war with Japan, called for the transfer of all the heavy bombers from Luzon to new bases in Mindanao, where they would be out of range of Japanese land-based planes stationed on Formosa. And during the first week in December, Brereton had sent 2 squadrons of B-17s to the recently constructed airfield at Del Monte in Mindanao. The decision to move only half his bomber force, Brereton justified by the fact that if he had all the heavy bombers transferred to base at Del Monte, there would have been no room for new bombers that were to arrive there from the United States. Regardless of the exact reason behind this decision, the reality was that MacArthur's first line of defense now lay destroyed in the ruins at Eber and Clark Field, and hopes that the heavy bombers would attack the Japanese invasion force while still on the sea, or cut their communication lines as part of the active defense of the Philippines, has gone on the first day of the war. Although largely overshadowed by the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor, the destruction of American air forces in the Philippines, Pearl of the Orient, on the same day was an equally catastrophic event that rounds out the tragedy of a day that will live in infamy. Developments of the first day of the war in the Pacific had placed the United States Army forces in the Far East in a precarious position, as not only did Japanese air raids on the Philippines leave MacArthur's primary tool of preventing the Japanese invasion, his flying fortresses wrecked at Clark Field, but also the bulk of the fleet that was supposed to bring reinforcements lay shattered at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. And now, as the Japanese removed any doubt that they had no intention of bypassing the archipelago, the Philippine garrison, virtually entirely surrounded, was left completely on their own, without any other option but to get ready for the inevitable invasion. In the following days, to further materialize the success achieved on December 8, 1941, the Japanese continued with the repeated air raids and systematic destruction of the American air and naval forces remaining on Luzon, striking port installations in Manila Bay, and air bases at Del Carmen, Nichols, and Nielsen Field that had been left untouched during the attacks on the first day. These air raids, interrupted only by periods of bad weather, caused not only heavy damage to ground installations, but also resulted in reducing the United States Far East Air Force to only a handful of serviceable P-40 fighters that were no longer able to prevent the Japanese from gaining complete air superiority over the Philippines. Furthermore, in fear that with the elimination of the Far East Air Force, and without air cover, his tiny force would face almost certain destruction, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commander of the United States Asiatic Fleet, at his discretion, following, however, the Navy's pre-war plan, ordered most of his ships to move south on December 8th, while following the destruction of the Navy Yard at Cavite in Manila Bay on December 10th. The rest of the fleet had left the Philippine waters to join the British and Dutch as a combined naval force in Borneo, leaving behind only a few submarines, PT boats, and other smaller surface ships to harass the Japanese amphibious force. Meanwhile, in parallel with air attacks, a Japanese invasion flotilla transporting 3 task forces assigned to spearhead the invasion of the Philippines steamed undetected and according to schedule towards their objective. According to the Imperial Japanese Army's daring plan, these task forces were to land in 3 separate areas on Luzon, some 10 days before the main invasion, with the mission of taking and holding the airfields at Apari, Vigan, and Legazpi that were to serve as advance bases for the planes of the 5th Air Group stationed in Formosa, and from where they had to fly almost to the edge of their operational range to reach the Philippines and get back. And for task to carry out this risky mission, the 14th Army commander, General Homma Masaharu, assigned the 2nd Formosa Infantry Regiment of the 48th Division under Colonel Toru Tanaka, further divided into 2 task forces named after their commanders, designated as Tanaka and Kano Detachment, that were to land on northern Luzon, and to the 33rd Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division, led by the division's commanding officer of Infantry Group, General Naoki Kimura, which was to land at Legazpi, southeast of Manila. Neither one of those advance landing detachments, which, with attached support units and engineers, numbered roughly 2,000 men, was strong enough to withstand a determined counterattack from even a single Philippine division. But regardless of risk, the Japanese planners hoped to catch the defenders off guard, and that these task forces would hold their ground until main invasion begins. But even before landings on Luzon, the first Japanese troops set foot on Philippine soil on the opening day of the war, at the dawn of December 8th, when some 490 men from a temporarily organized naval landing unit came ashore unopposed on Batan Island in Luzon Strait, about halfway between Formosa and Luzon, where they seized the airfield, finding it to be in poor condition and barely suitable for fighter and reconnaissance planes. 2 days later, on December 10th, the elements of this same attack force occupied Camiguin Island further south, where the engineers quickly established a seaplane base. At the first light of dawn on the same day, December 10th, the convoys with Tanaka and Kano Detachment reached their positions off North Luzon's coast near Vigan and Apari, without having sighted a single American aircraft during the entire trip. Under cover of fighter planes from Formosa, and protected by 1 light cruiser and several destroyers, the Tanaka Detachment formed out of the regimental headquarters, the 2nd Battalion and half of the 1st Battalion, and with other engineer and supporting units attached, began landing over the high seas and strong wind, unopposed. Due to poor weather conditions, only 2 infantry companies made it to shore at Apari, while the rest of the Tanaka Detachment sailed some 35 kilometers east, where they disembarked in the area that provided partial protection from the heavy surf. Yet, even such a small force of only 2 Japanese companies that had landed at Apari was sufficient to persuade the city's garrison, which consisted of a single company from the 3rd Battalion of the 12th Infantry Regiment from the 11th Philippine Division, commanded by a young reserve officer, Lieutenant Alvin C. Hadley, to, after sending a report about the Japanese invasion to battalion headquarters at Tuguegarao, retreat south without firing a shot. However, the more spirited response came from the American Air Force when, in the morning, 2 B-17s appeared over the Japanese fleet while unloading was in full swing. The first plane dropped its bombs over the transport area before being driven off by the Japanese fighter aircraft, while the second B-17, piloted by Captain Colin Kelly, attacked and allegedly scored a direct hit on a large warship mistakenly identified as Battleship Haruna, even though, at that point, there were no battleships anywhere near the Philippine waters. On return to Clark Field, a squadron of Japanese Zeros intercepted Kelly's plane and inflicted severe damage to a lone bomber, but despite continuous attacks, Kelly remained at the bomber's controls long enough for his crew to bail out safely before the plane exploded while he was still in it. His action made him the first United States Air Force hero of the war, and in recognition of his bravery, he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. These airstrikes failed, however, to seriously threaten the Japanese landings, and by 1 p.m., the Tanaka Detachment was ashore. Before nightfall, they had reached Apari, completing their primary mission of capturing the airfield where construction troops and air service units moved in immediately, and began to extend the airfields, establish depots, and ready the airstrip for operations. Simultaneously with the landing at Apari, the Kano Detachment formed out of the 3rd Battalion, and the rest of the 1st Battalion began unloading along the coast near Vigan under far worse weather conditions than in northern Luzon, which made it possible for only a fraction of the Japanese force to get ashore that morning. But despite their small number, these men managed to occupy the town by 10:30 a.m., and just as at Apari, the only American response came from the air when at about 6 a.m., not long after being spotted by a reconnaissance plane patrolling along Luzon's western shore, this task force came under attack by the 5 B-17s escorted by several P-40s, which, in combination with rough seas, prevented any further Japanese landings of troops and supplies for the rest of the day. These sporadic air attacks of December 10th, which resulted in the sinking of one Japanese minesweeper and the damaging of 2 transport vessels and a few warships, represented the last coordinated effort of the Far East Air Force, as well as the only attempt to disrupt the initial invasion, since neither General MacArthur nor General Jonathan Wainwright, commander of North Luzon Force, made any other effort to mount a counterattack or at least to harass the small Japanese task forces that had just come ashore on the Philippines. Instead, although correctly assuming that the landings at Apari and Vigan were secondary attacks aimed at acquiring airfields on Luzon and diversions intended to draw and spread the American forces, they both strived to gather their largely dispersed units and consolidate their defenses, anticipating the main Japanese invasion to come, most likely in the Lingayen Gulf, from where the invaders had a shortest route that runs directly to Manila. Therefore, Wainwright ordered the 11th Division to pull back from northern Luzon and take up the position in a mountainous area between San Fernando and Negilian to defend Lingayen Gulf and to block Route 3 to prevent the Kano and Tanaka detachments from moving south. The Philippine Scouts 26th Cavalry Regiment served as the mobile reserve to the 11th Division, which had been reinforced by the 71st Infantry Regiment of the 71st Philippine Division, while the 21st Division took the position south of Lingayen and the 31st Division was north of Subic Bay. Meanwhile, on December 11th, the remainder of the Kano detachment finally got ashore some 6 kilometers north of their assigned landing beach, and after regrouping at the coast, the bulk of the detachment proceeded towards Vigan, while a small force went some 80 kilometers north to occupy Laoag and the adjacent airfield, which they did by the following evening. By then, Kano and Tanaka detachments had established a firm foothold on Luzon and control over airfields at Apari, Vigan, and Laoag, which, although in poor condition, soon become operational bases for fighter planes of the 5th Air Group. Surprised by the complete absence of any American and Filipino resistance on a mission that was supposed to be suicidal, Colonel Tanaka ordered his detachment to head south, and by December 12th, they had reached Tuguegarao Airfield, some 80 kilometers south of Apari, from where the 3rd Battalion of the 11th Philippine Division had already withdrawn. Thus, encouraged by the success achieved so far, Tanaka decided to leave only small garrisons to hold the seized airfields and send the bulk of his force to march around the northern tip of Luzon along Route 3 to Vigan to link up with the Kano detachment, and then the reformed 2nd Formosa Infantry Regiment would proceed south along the Route 3 towards Lingayen Gulf to support the main landings of the 14th Army. In the meantime, the Japanese operation moved on. In the early morning of December 12th, the 3rd Japanese Task Force, composed of the 33rd Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division, also known as Kimura Detachment, named after its commander, with approximately 2,000 men, reinforced by the 1st Kure Special Naval Landing Force with 575 men and protected by 1 light cruiser and several destroyers, with close air support provided by the planes from the aircraft carrier Ryujo, began landing near Legazpi in southeast Luzon, and by 9 a.m. they were already in control of the town and airfield without encountering any resistance. Once Legazpi was firmly in his hands, General Naoki Kimura ordered his force to advance northwest towards Lamon Bay, where the rest of the 16th Division was supposed to land ashore within days, and as Kimura Detachment pushed north on December 17th, the leading patrol ran into a demolition detachment of the 51st Engineer Battalion from the 51st Philippine Division, working on a bridge near Naga in an attempt to cover the division's withdrawal, which led to a minor skirmish. Brief clashes between patrols of advancing Japanese and retreating men of the 51st Division continued in the following days. Now that the Japanese had made 3 landings on Luzon, and as no one knew where they would strike next, rumors began to spread about their invasions all over the archipelago, whilst Filipino civilians saw the danger everywhere. And as the ill-prepared Philippine Army, still in the process of mobilization with limited armored forces, inadequate artillery, and no anti-tank weapons, had to control the vast coastal area with little hope for rapid reinforcement, as signals from Washington had made it clear that there was no point in sending more resources to a lost cause. In these circumstances, on December 15th, General Louis Brereton, commander of a Far East Air Force, requested to move the remaining B-17s based at Del Monte Field on Mindanao to Darwin in northwest Australia. After securing MacArthur's approval on December 17th, 10 flyable bombers had reached Bachelor Field outside Darwin, and following evacuation to Australia, the Far East Air Force's strength on Luzon consisted of only 20 operational fighters. This evacuation was pulled off at the last moment, since only 3 days later, on December 20th, the Miura Detachment, made of the elements of the 33rd Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division and the Sakaguchi Detachment formed of the reinforced 146th Infantry Regiment from the 56th Japanese Infantry Division, with the combined strength of more than 5,000 soldiers, came ashore at Davao in Mindanao in the southern Philippines. The 56th Division, which had arrived from Palau Islands, was under 16th Army control, and this action was part of a much broader operation intended primarily to provide bases for the Japanese drive on Borneo, though it was an integral part of the 14th Army's plan of seizing the Philippines. At 4 a.m., the Japanese troops came ashore along the coast on both sides of Davao, defended by the 2nd Battalion of the 101st Regiment from the 101st Philippine Division, which offered some minor resistance before pulling back along the road leading northwest into the hills, and by 3 p.m., the city and its airfield were occupied. The Japanese failed, however, to use the momentum to seize the entire Mindanao, including Del Monte Field, as a few days later, the Sakaguchi Detachment departed to Jolo Island and further to Borneo, following the narrow timetable of the broader Japanese plan, leaving the Miura Detachment at Davao. The first phase of the Japanese operation in the Philippines had been surprisingly successful, exceeding all expectations, even among the most optimistic ones. Not only did they now, after 4 landings at separate points, establish a strong presence in Luzon and Mindanao and had control over several airfields, but in less than 2 weeks they had successfully driven the United States Air Force and Navy out of the archipelago. And, for the doomed Philippine garrison, the worst was still to come. For almost 2 weeks, the progress of the first phase of the Japanese operation to seize control of the Philippines unfolded with precision and effectiveness that surpassed even the most ambitious projections. The initial landings, carried out by the Tanaka and Kano detachments of the 2nd Formosa Infantry Regiment from the 48th Division at Apari and Vigan, resulted in remarkable success. And not only did these detachments secure vital airfields in northern Luzon that quickly became advance bases for the short-range fighters of the 5th Air Group, but due to absence of any American and Filipino response, both forces now joined together were free to advance towards Lingayen Gulf to support the main landings of the 14th Army. Further south, the 3rd Japanese force that landed on Luzon, Kimura Detachment of the 33rd Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division, thrust forward from Legazpi towards Lamon Bay, where they were to meet the remainder of the 16th Division, who were supposed to come ashore there within next few days. In the meantime, the execution of the next phase of the Japanese operational plan was well underway, and by December 20th, 1941, the convoys with main elements of the 14th Army were already nearing the coast of Luzon. However, despite their best efforts to avoid detection, the voyage of such a large convoy could not pass unnoticed. From December 18th, the first reports about a Japanese convoy moving toward the Philippines from the north began arriving in MacArthur's headquarters in Manila, while at about 1:13 p.m. on December 21st, the United States Navy's submarine USS Stingray, on patrol off the West Luzon's coast, gave a more accurate report about a large Japanese fleet heading towards Lingayen Gulf, and, by the time the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of December 21st, this formidable Japanese armada, with over 100 cargo ships, escorted by numerous warships, carrying the main body of the 14th Army aboard the transports, comprised of some 43,110 men, with its main combat element centered mainly around the remainder of the 48th Division, reinforced by the 9th Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division, along with the 4th and 7th Tank Regiments, as well as a large number of artillery, service and various other special units, had reached their final anchorage at Lingayen Gulf. Before the dawn broke on December 22nd, amidst harsh weather and high seas, shrouded in disorder so typical while executing such large-scale amphibious operations, the Japanese began landing along Lingayen's Gulf east coast in the area where the nearby mountains sloped away into the narrow coastal plain on the beaches that extended some 24 kilometers from the village of Bawang on the north to Agu in the south, and through which ran Route 3, an excellent hard-surface highway that in its southern end expands into the good road network leading directly into Manila. At about 5:17 a.m., the leading elements of the 47th Infantry Regiment, along with the elements of the 4th Tank Regiment, touched down on the beach south of the small village of Agu, closely followed by the 1st Formosa Infantry Regiment and the 7th Tank Regiment, that came ashore at 5:30 a.m. near Arengay in the centre, suffering more from the heavy surf that overturned and threw many landing craft up on the beach than from American and Filipino fire. Another force tasked to protect the right flank of the Japanese beachhead, consisting of the 48th Reconnaissance and the remainder of the 4th Tank Regiment, came ashore at 7:30 a.m. in the southernmost sector of the invasion zone north of Damortis. Even though the Japanese landing at Lingayen Gulf did not come as a surprise to the Philippine garrison, and despite all the early warnings, they were poorly prepared to drive off the invaders, so except for the sporadic fire from the pair of 155mm guns of the 86th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned at San Fabian, resistance the Japanese encountered on the beaches was virtually non-existent. The only notable resistance came at 8:30 a.m., when the elements of the 9th Regiment of the 16th Japanese Division, designated as Kamijima Detachment, on their way to the shore near the village of Bawang, got caught by machine gun fire from the headquarters battalion of the 12th Infantry Regiment of the 11th Philippine Division, positioned at the beach, inflicting heavy casualties among the Japanese. However, the poorly trained Filipino units were no match for the highly disciplined Japanese soldiers and were unable to prevent the Kamijima detachment from advancing inland, so they swiftly fell apart and withdrew. Much like the Philippine armies, the initial efforts of the U.S. Navy and Air Force to obstruct the invasion were equally modest. Somewhere around 8 a.m., submarine S-38, one of 6 patrolling in Lingayen Gulf, sneaked into shallow waters and sank transport Heo Maru, achieving one of the first Navy victories in the war, and shortly after, another submarine, USS Seal, on patrol in the area south of Vigan, sent another cargo ship, Hayataka Maru, to the bottom of South China Sea. Alongside the submarines, 4 B-17s flying from bases in Australia, escorted by several P-40s, after completing a bombing run on Davao, proceeded towards Lingayen Gulf and, after slipping through the protective screen of Japanese fighters, strafed some of the escort and transport ships without causing any severe damage. Meanwhile, even though landing heavy equipment such as motor transport and artillery proved impossible over the rough sea, nevertheless, through the morning, the Japanese successfully brought most of the infantry ashore, who now rushed to establish a firm beachhead and advance inland before American and Filipino units could set up a defensive line on the nearby mountains. Therefore, after securing Bawang and the surrounding area, the commander of the 9th Regiment, Colonel Kamijima, dispatched the patrol north to rendezvous with Colonel Tanaka's 2nd Formosa Regiment, and by 11 a.m., 2 forces had made contact. At the same time, the 3rd Battalion advanced eastward along the road which ran through Cordillera Mountains to Baguio and further to Rosario to protect the beachhead and prevent any potential counterattack from the east. Without realizing it, this Japanese maneuver endangered the left flank of the 71st Regiment of the 71st Philippine Division en route to San Fernando, where they were to confront the 2nd Formosa Regiment, which rapidly drove south from Vigan. As the 71st Regiment's position became untenable, they withdrew down the road to Baguio, where they joined the 11th Division, which was also falling back to the south in the face of the Japanese advance. The 71st Regiment remained in Baguio to protect the 11th Division's withdrawal until the night when they pulled back east through the mountains. Further south, after regrouping at the beach near Aringay, the 1st Formosa Infantry Regiment and the 7th Tank Regiment moved down the coastal road, where they, in the early afternoon, had linked up with the 47th Infantry and the 4th Tank Regiment near Agu. From there, the 1st Formosa Infantry Regiment pressed south along Route 3 towards De Mortis, while the 47th Regiment proceeded via the second axe of advance through the parallel road that extended east to Rosario. At about the same time, after recovering from the initial shock, the Americans threw whatever they had to stop or at least slow down the Japanese from coming down the coast long enough until reinforcements arrived. As a first response, Brigadier General William E. Broger, commander of the 11th Division, which was withdrawing south, sent forward a single infantry battalion through De Mortis to, if possible, disrupt the landing at Agu. However, by the time they arrived, the Japanese were already well ashore, and in the skirmish that followed, they routed the poorly trained Philippine Army soldiers with ease, forcing the survivors to fall back to De Mortis. In the meantime, General Jonathan Wainwright, North Luzon Force Commander, ordered his mobile reserve, the 26th Philippine Scouts Cavalry Regiment, supported by the 192nd Tank Battalion, to move from Pozo Rubio to the sector between Rosario and De Mortis. But because of a shortage of gasoline, the commander of the 192nd Tank Battalion could spare only one 5-tank platoon from Company C. As the main body of the 26th Cavalry Regiment advanced toward Rosario, the scout car platoon moving ahead had reached De Mortis and pushed northward along the coastal road, where they ran into the forward elements of the 48th Reconnaissance and 4th Tank Regiments and fell back to De Mortis. Shortly after, at 9 a.m., the rest of the 26th Cavalry Regiment joined them at the town, where they had established defensive positions. At about 1 p.m., the cavalrymen came under heavy attack by Japanese infantry and armor, supported by planes of the 5th Air Group that caused heavy casualties. But, with the aid of 5 Stuart tanks of the 2nd Platoon from Companies C of the 192nd Tank Battalion, which became engaged in combat with Japanese light tanks, Philippine scouts held their ground until 4 p.m., when the 1st Formosa Regiment joined the attack. After enduring hours of intense battle, faced with the overwhelming Japanese force, and following the destruction of 1 and damaging of 4 other American tanks, the outnumbered defenders withdrew towards Rosario, which had become the pivotal point of American resistance throughout the night. Nevertheless, by the morning, following a wild fight on the streets, the town fell to the Japanese hands, while the battered 26th Cavalry Regiment pulled back further south to Pozo Rubio. The main Japanese landings at Lingayen Gulf resulted in another great success, as, despite bad weather and heavy seas, they had completed the most critical part of the operation and secured most of their objectives, landing safely along the beaches between Bawang and Agu and pushing north, south and east, seizing the roads through the mountains, and occupied De Mortis and Rosario while suffering very modest casualties. However, the resistance of the well-disciplined Philippine scouts from the 26th Cavalry Regiment and tankers of the 192nd Tank Battalion, although insufficient to stop the Japanese advance, held them down long enough to allow General Wainwright to bring up his reserves, and by the morning of December 23rd, the elements of the 4 Philippine divisions were already taking positions along Lingayen Gulf and the road leading south from Rosario. The 71st Division, without its 71st Regiment, reinforced by the 91st Regiment from the 91st Division, blocked Route 3 south of Sison, and the 21st Division moved north to take the beach defences on the southern shore of Lingayen Gulf, while the 11th Division took the position in the centre, protecting the approaches to the Agno River, the first formidable obstacle standing in front of a Japanese force on their way south from Lingayen Gulf to Manila. The fighting on December 23rd began in the early morning when the 47th Regiment, moving south from Rosario, struck the 71st Division's line near Sison, where, supported by artillery, Filipino soldiers held off the Japanese advance until noon. During the early afternoon, the 48th Reconnaissance and 4th Tank Regiments joined the attack, amplifying the pressure on the weary defenders until it became unbearable, causing the Filipinos from the 71st Division to break down and flee, leaving the artillery behind. By 7 p.m., as the Japanese entered Sison, the 71st Division withdrew to a line just north of Pozzo-Rubio, where they soon joined forces with the 91st Regiment, which was delayed en route by a destroyed bridge across the Agno River. The 26th Cavalry, assigned as the 71st Division Reserve retreat from Pozzo-Rubio further down the road to Binalonan, where it would set up an outpost line through which the remainder of the division could fall back if necessary. During the night, the Japanese attacked the 91st Regiment's positions, driving them out of the Pozzo-Rubio, and by the morning of December 24th, the Japanese, spearheaded by the 4th Tank Regiment, had made contact with the 26th Cavalry outposts north and west of Binalonan. Once again, the Philippine scouts put out a fierce defense, and although they had no anti-tank guns nor artillery, they managed to repel the first attack and even mount a counterattack. Sometime during the morning, the 2nd Formosa Regiment joined the attack, while the 4th Tank Regiment swung west to bypass the American positions, putting the cavalrymen in great danger. For more than 4 hours, the cavalrymen held their position against overwhelming odds, inflicting many casualties on the attackers until 3:30 p.m., at which point they began to withdraw, and by dusk they had crossed the Agno River and reached Tayug. In a valiant effort to halt the Japanese from breaking through along Route 3, the 26th Cavalry Regiment suffered heavy losses, and by December 24th, out of its original strength of 842 officers and men, only 450 remained. And, while the front line at Lingayen Gulf came on the verge of collapsing, the Japanese mounted a secondary effort at Lemon Bay with the remainder of the 16th Division, as its 9th Regiment had been temporarily assigned to the 48th Division, while the 33rd had landed at Legazpi a few days earlier. The 16th Division's main combat elements consisted primarily of the 3 battalions from the 20th Infantry Regiment, Division Headquarters Group, and the 22nd Mountain Artillery, which together with some other attached and support troops numbered approximately 7,000 men. Before the dawn of December 24th, the 16th Division began landing at 3 points along the shore of Laman Bay, at Mauban, Atimonan, and Siain, in the sector defended by heavily dispersed units of the 51st Division from South Luzon Force. Given that the 41st Division, responsible for the defense of the western shore, was en route to Manila, the 1st Regular Division of the Philippine Army, from South Luzon Force Reserve, was to relieve the elements of the 51st Division to allow them to reposition southward to engage the advancing Kimura detachment, and, just when the 1st Regiment from the 1st Regular Division relieved the 3rd Battalion from the 52nd Regiment, at the crack of dawn on December 24th, the 1st Japanese detachment formed of the 2nd Battalion of the 20th Regiment came ashore at Mauban, where the Filipino forces met the invaders with fierce resistance, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese. However, after heavy fighting, by 8 a.m., the Philippine Army troops had been pushed back, first into Mauban, and by the evening, the 1st Regiment fell back some 8 kilometers to the west, where they set up a defensive position and put out a stubborn defense that finally halted the advancing Japanese. In the southernmost sector of the invasion zone, the 1st Battalion from the 20th Regiment landed in the south at Siain with the first light of dawn without difficulty, and, after consolidating at the beach, at 7 a.m., the battalion split forces into 2 columns, with the first one advancing south to make contact with Kimura detachment, and the other proceeding west towards Tayabas Bay. By evening, both columns made satisfactory progress, encountering only sporadic opposition from the 1st Battalion of the 52nd Regiment from the 51st Division in the south. In the centre, the 16th Division's main force formed out of the 3rd Battalion, the 16th Reconnaissance Regiment, the 16th Engineers, and the 22nd Field Artillery, came ashore some 3 kilometers south of Atimonan, where they were met by stiff resistance from the elements of the 52nd Regiment from the 51st Division. But despite determined opposition, by 11 a.m., Atimonan was in Japanese hands, while the already weakened Philippine troops retreated west towards Malikbay. By the end of the day, 52nd Regiment was driven back some 6 kilometers further west, where they joined the 53rd Regiment and set up a defensive position along a river near Binahan. During the night, the main body of the 16th Division struck the Philippine Army positions, and under cover of darkness, the defenders withdrew toward Pagbilao. Just like the 48th Divisions in the north, the landings of the 16th Division resulted in yet another triumph that brought the Japanese forces to the doorstep of Manila, and this maneuver drove the Philippine Army into a challenging battle on two fronts, threatening to trap them in a pincer movement. And, as the stream of supplies and men, now undisturbed, poured to the shores of Lingayen and Lamon Gulfs, the appealing prospect of victory seemed within sight to even the highest pessimist. Thus, after days of anxiety, on December 24th, with a tremendous sense of relief, General Homa Masaharu, commander of the 14th Army, brought his staff ashore at Bawang, where he established his headquarters. To make matters even worse, the Japanese landings at Lamon Bay came amid the reorganization of the United States Army forces in the Far East. At the same time, when the 16th Japanese Division was rushing ashore, General George Parker was just in the process of handing over command of the South Luzon Force to General Albert M. Jones, former commander of the 51st Philippine Division, before he left for Bataan to take command over a newly formed Bataan Defense Force tasked to prepare defensive positions on the peninsula. Ever since the first Japanese soldier set foot on Philippine soil, the American estimates about the actual strength of Japanese troops were highly exaggerated, and since the first reports indicated that the Lingayen Gulf Force had an approximate strength between 80,000 to 100,000 men, with an estimated additional 40,000 men, which had landed at Lamon Bay. Therefore, as the Japanese had established, secured footholds on the beaches and advanced towards Manila almost effortlessly. Based on these reports, all MacArthur's hopes to meet the invaders at the beaches and drive them back into the sea with an offensive action were now shattered. Faced with the grim reality of the situation over the past 10 days, MacArthur began seriously considering the possibility of an eventual withdrawal to Bataan and the evacuation of Manila. Thereby, on December 24th, MacArthur decided to bring back to effect War Plan Orange 3, a strategy earlier dismissed as overly defensive, while at the same time he also initiated the transfer of his headquarters and the Commonwealth government to Corregidor Island. And in order to save the capital from destruction, he intended to declare Manila an open city. War Plan Orange 3 was an old pre-war plan, well known to all U.S. Army officers, that called for withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula, where, as the planners hoped, the Philippine garrison could withstand a prolonged siege until help arrived. But before the bulk of the Philippine Army and sufficient supplies could reach Bataan, it was crucial to hold off the Japanese advance for another few days. Before the war, Philippine Army headquarters had selected several potential delaying positions along the central Luzon plain that were considered relatively good defensive lines to cover routes of withdrawal to Bataan. At each line, the North Luzon force was to hold on just long enough to delay the Japanese advance with as few losses as possible to give the South Luzon force ample time to reach Bataan. According to the plan, the ultimate goal was not to stop the advance, but only delay the Japanese, so each line was to be occupied before dawn, held during the day, and afterwards evacuated during the night. Withdrawal to the following line was to be covered by a small rear guard of the retiring force, which was to remain in their position just long enough to force the Japanese to organize the attack before hastily pulling back to rejoin its parent unit, aiming to buy an extra hour or two. And with this carefully staged choreography, MacArthur intended to gain sufficient time to prepare defenses on Bataan and to permit the South Luzon force to pass into the peninsula behind the North Luzon force. As the first step of executing the plan, on December 24th, MacArthur approved General Wainwright's request to pull back his force closer to the Agno River, and by the evening, the badly disorganized North Luzon force took over the first out of 5 defensive lines, which extended from Tayug on the east, held by elements of the 71st and 91st Divisions, along with already exhausted Philippine scouts of the 26th Cavalry Regiment, to Aguilar on the west, in the sector defended by the 21st Division that had withdrawn from the southern shore of Lingayen Gulf in the late afternoon, while the 11th Division held a thin front from Urdaneta to San Carlos in the center, and just a few kilometers behind this defensive line, the engineers were already preparing another one. Moreover, even the term line, in this case, was exaggerated as the front was too wide to be held continuously by the forces available to General Wainwright. Instead, He relied to a large degree on the engineers who were to destroy the bridges and block the roads, while the infantry was to occupy positions to cover the most likely routes of the Japanese approach. However, holding off the Japanese for one day proved much more challenging than planned. Upon penetrating the central Luzon plain, General Homa Masaharu divided his forces into two columns, with the 1st and 2nd Formosa regiments, together with the 4th Tank Regiment, spearheading the advance along the right flank, while the 48th Reconnaissance and 47th Infantry Regiment proceeding towards Tayug. And so, early on Christmas morning, the Japanese war machine broke the quiet of silent night, when at 2 a.m. on December 25th, the 1st and 2nd Formosa and the 4th Tank Regiment struck the positions held by the 11th Division at Urdaneta, and in the battle that spanned the entire morning, the Japanese proved too strong for the Filipino soldiers, and by noon they had seized control of the town, forcing the 11th Division to retreat towards the Agno, where it took the position between Carmen and Bautista to hold the crucial bridges in that area. On the 11th Division's left flank, the 21st Division fell back a few kilometers south to a second line, while on the right, the 91st Division assumed the responsibility of holding the line as the 71st Division, ordered to reorganize in San Fernando, withdrew, leaving the 26th Cavalry Regiment to stand at Tayug, guarding the retreating forces, where they held off repeated attacks by the 48th Reconnaissance Regiment until 4 a.m. of December 26th, when the scouts broke off the action, leaving the town in Japanese hands. Following the loss of Tayug, the 91st Division withdrew to Umingan, about 15 kilometers to the southeast, blowing 8 bridges between Tayug and San Quintin as it retired, whereas the decimated 26th Cavalry Regiment under new orders continued south toward Bataan to serve as a reserve to North Luzon force. In the meantime, the 1st and 2nd Formosa and the 4th Tank Regiment pressed south towards Carmen, where they, by 7 p.m. of December 26th, annihilated the 1st Battalion of the 21st Regiment from the 11th Division before they crossed the Agno River near the village of Villasis after sunset, and 2 hours later, the Japanese were in Rosales. To prevent a complete collapse of the line and to cover the withdrawal of the 11th Division, Wainwright threw in his last reserve, the 194th Tank Battalion, which had just arrived from Manila, and the 192nd Tank Battalion, which successfully delayed the Japanese advance enough for the remainder of the North Luzon force to retreat on another day's line. In parallel with the North Luzon force, the South Luzon force, under the newly appointed Commander General Albert Jones, began to withdraw west and north along successive lines of defense around Matbanahao, and even though units under General Jones faced numerically smaller Japanese forces than their comrades in North Luzon, his position, although far from desperate, was not favorable. Unlike Wainwright in the north, he had no phase lines or previously selected positions to fall back on. Instead, he improvised a system of delaying positions along terrain favorable to the defense. But, on the other hand, the South Luzon force had to focus more on the withdrawal that required the closest coordination between units and accurate timing for a maneuver rather than harassing or delaying the Japanese. The withdrawal of the South Luzon force began during the night of December 24th, when the 1st Regiment of the 1st Philippine Regular Division pulled back without being ordered from their positions west of Mauban along the road that runs around the southeastern slopes of Mount Banahao towards Lukban, about 13 kilometers further west. Here, on the morning of December 25th, they put out a stiff resistance when the Japanese finally arrived, and after a hard fight that lasted for several hours, at about 2 p.m., the outnumbered Japanese forced defenders to pull out and fall back toward Louisiana to the northwest, where they held their ground for the next few days. Further south, the bulk of the 16th Division advanced towards the road junction at Pagbilao, held by the 52nd and 53rd Regiments from the 51st Division, which had briefly held off the Japanese by demolishing the bridge over the Palsabangan River before withdrawing rapidly southwest, blowing bridges while they were falling back, until reaching Sariaya at the evening of December 26th, and from there on December 27th, they retreated to Candelaria. However, during the withdrawal, the units of the 51st Division became so mixed that it was practically impossible to call them by their proper designations. In the meantime, the rear echelon worked valiantly to get all the supplies out of Manila, so within days, Corregidor Island was completely stocked with the supplies for a 6-month campaign, including hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline, tons of ammunition and food, while in addition, plenty more stock of supplies was shipped directly to Bataan. Unfortunately, moving supplies to Bataan, considering the chronic lack of transport vehicles, proved to be a difficult task, so as a result, plenty of material was left behind to the Japanese, including a 5-year supply of rice, some 5,000 tons, stored at Government Rice Central at Cabanatuan under still unclear circumstances. However, as the transfer of supplies drew to a close, while the complicated movement of thousands of men from North and South Luzon towards Bataan was still ongoing, on December 26th, MacArthur declared Manila an open city. From early December 1941, the smell of defeat hung heavy over the Philippines. After Japanese bombers had reduced American airfields to smoldering craters, destroying the United States Air Force based in the archipelago, and following the landings at Apari, Vigan, Legazpi and Davao on Mindanao, which were mere preludes to the main event, on December 22nd, the full might of the 14th Imperial Japanese Army under General Homma Masaharu slammed into Lingayen Gulf, and 2 days later, the second major Japanese force successfully stormed the shores of Layman Bay. The invaders encountered only scattered resistance offered by the poorly trained and under-equipped Philippine army, quickly splitting Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, wide open as the heavily reinforced 48th Division surged south from the Lingayen Gulf. Simultaneously, the bulk of the 16th Division clawed its way from the north, and within days of the invasion, the Japanese forces, after securing a firm foothold, now stood ready for the final drive towards their primary objective, a glittering prize which seemed well within reach, the Philippine capital, Manila. However, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. and Filipino forces in the islands, General Douglas MacArthur, had other plans in mind. Given that his gamble to hold the invaders at the beaches had failed miserably, allowing the Japanese to break into Luzon's central plain from the north and get close to the Philippine capital from the south, now with his back to the wall, he had no other alternative but to order his troops on Luzon to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. There, he planned to make a last stand on the harsh terrain, where the Philippine army could withstand Japanese attacks long enough, hoping to buy time until any help arrived, while at the same time denying them entrance to Manila Bay, as outlined in a pre-war plan designated as War Plan Orange 3. To fortify his last stand, MacArthur formed the Bataan Defense Force under the former commander of the South Luzon Force, General George Parker, composed of the 31st and 41st Philippine Army Divisions and the American Philippine Division. At the same time, to save the capital from destruction and to minimize civilian casualties, MacArthur decided to abandon all efforts to defend Manila, and therefore, on December 26th, he declared it an open city, leaving the Japanese free to, according to international law, occupy it peacefully. However, even though all newspapers published and radio stations broadcast MacArthur's proclamation throughout the day, the news about it failed to reach the Japanese in the Philippines, so the following day, the Imperial Japanese Army's and Navy's Air Force carried out several bombing raids directed against the shipping and port installations in Manila Bay, as well as airfields in the city's outskirts, causing great destruction and covering Manila with heavy smoke and flame. It was not until December 28th that Japanese forces in the Philippines received information from Tokyo that MacArthur had no intentions to defend the capital. In the meantime, on the ground, the Philippine Army was already on its way towards the last bastion in the Bataan Peninsula. Starting from December 24th, the North Luzon Force under General Jonathan Wainwright began fighting retreat in stages along 5 successive lines of defense, set up not to halt but merely delay the Japanese advance long enough for the South Luzon Force, commanded by General Albert Jones, to reach San Fernando, and from there, both forces were to proceed further to Bataan, along the only main road running into the peninsula. This demanding maneuver, however, required accurate timing and the closest coordination between the two forces at every step back, since if the defense of either one would crumble, it would leave the other exposed and allow the Japanese to either encircle all the Philippine troops south of Manila or to cut off the roads leading to Bataan, endangering the rear of the troops withdrawing from the north. By the evening of December 26th, after a brutal baptism of fire and days of heavy combat, Wainwright's force occupied the positions on the third delaying line, where they braced for yet another Japanese attack that never came. Instead, an unsettling silence descended. On December 27th, after a swift advance from Lingayen Gulf, General Homer ordered his troops to stop and regroup at the Agno River to bring up more troops and artillery for the final push towards Manila. To carry out this mission, he assigned the bulk of his force spearheaded by the regrouped 48th Division and reinforced with the 4th and 7th Tank Regiments. This task force was to advance along Route 5, the most direct route to Manila, and for the protection of their right flank, he had now brought the Kamijima Detachment, composed of the 9th Infantry Regiment from the 16th Division and supporting artillery which had backed the main landings of the 48th Division from their positions along the Lingayen coast. This sudden pause in the Japanese advance gave General Wainwright much-needed time to consolidate his troops and orchestrate an orderly retreat to the 4th defensive line in an area at which the Pampanga River, which flows from northeast to south, and as such, presented a formidable natural barrier to both the Japanese and Philippine forces, dominated the landscape, and where Wainwright, concerned about the rapid withdrawals of the past few days, intended to hold out as long as possible to give the South Luzon force and rear echelon retreating from Manila enough time to safely cross the two bridges over a fast-flowing Pampanga River at Calumpit, situated about halfway from Manila to San Fernando, at the bottleneck, which soon became a critical point in the plan for withdrawal, which had to be held by all available means until the troops of the South Luzon force crossed them. By nightfall of December 27th, the North Luzon force was in place, with the 91st Division occupying the positions near a crucial road junction at Route 5 in Cabanatuan, on the eastern edge of Luzon's central plain. The 11th Division held the center in the area near Carmen, while the 21st Division stood firm at Tarlac on the east. The following day, on December 28th, the calm before the storm shattered when the Japanese offensive roared back to life. By dawn of December 29th, the bulk of the 48th Division, moving from two directions and spearheaded by the 4th and 7th Tank Regiments, had struck positions held by the 91st Philippine Division at Cabanatuan. The Filipinos, caught in a pincer movement and overwhelmed by a superior force, crumbled under pressure, and after suffering heavy losses, the decimated 91st Division descent into a retreat, first falling back to Gapan, some 20 kilometers south of Cabanatuan, but the relentless attacker pressed on. So at the morning of December 31st, Baliwag, another 40 kilometers further south, became their next desperate stand. Not only did the rapid Japanese dash along Route 5 penetrate the 91st Division's line wide open and push them back far beyond the last delaying position, threatening South Luzon forces' escape route over the bridges at Calumpit, but at the same time, it exposed the entire North Luzon forces' right flank. Therefore, on December 30th, the Cano detachment of the 2nd Formosa Regiment, which had taken part in the initial invasion, having landed at Vigan on December 10th, and was now temporarily assigned to assist the Kamijima detachment in its advance towards San Fernando, took advantage of the breakthrough achieved by the 48th Division and turned right at Cabanatuan to continue along the road leading to Tarlac. In a desperate rush to outflank the Filipino line, bicycle-mounted infantry that preceded the rest of the detachment had disregarded all security measures, and at about 3 a.m. they had stumbled on several Stuart tanks from the 192nd Tank Battalion patrolling the area just west of Carmen, near the village of Zaragoza, which greeted them with point-blank fire, inflicting them heavy casualties. Still, despite heavy losses, highly determined and motivated Japanese pressed on, but the weary Filipino defenders from the 11th Division, backed by the tanks of the 192nd Tank Battalion, held the line stubbornly, gradually pulling back west and reducing their opponent's progress to a crawl for the remainder of the day. As the Kano detachment struck eastward, further to the west, Colonel Kamijima led his detachment into an assault against the positions south of Tarlac, held by the 21st Division, until then still untested in battle. Burdened by heavy casualties suffered during the landings at Lingayen Gulf, Kamijima advanced with excessive caution, and his hesitancy would prove fatal. Not only did the 9th Regiment suffer severe losses on its way, but determined defenders claimed his life on the road just south of Tarlac, and, with the death of Colonel Kamijima, the unit got a new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Katsumi Takahashi, and hence a new designation, Takahashi Detachment. In the afternoon, when the battle reached its peak, the elements of the 11th Division and the 192nd Tank Battalion, pushed from the east, surged into the 21st Division's zone of operation, already occupied by the Japanese, causing the front lines to become blurred, turning friend into foe in the fog of war. Amidst this chaos, crews of several precious Stuart tanks and half-tracks armed with 75mm guns found themselves on the wrong side of destroyed bridges over an impassable stream that forced them to abandon their precious vehicles and carry out on foot until they reached safety behind the 21st Division's lines. At some point late in the afternoon, the 11th and 21st Divisions received orders to withdraw under the veil of night to the final delaying line some 10 kilometers further south, and by the dawn of December 31st, covered by the fire of the 21st Field Artillery, they had reached their designated point. In its baptism of fire, the 21st Division performed well, and despite many casualties, they put out a fierce resistance and held their ground firmly for over 24 hours until pulling back in good order. Now, alongside the 11th Division, they protected the approaches to San Fernando on a line open only to frontal attacks, which extended from the steep heights of the Zambales Mountains west of Bamban to rugged 1,026 meters high Mount Arayat and bounded by the impassable barrier of the 30-kilometer-long Candaba Swamp to the east. The valiant effort of the North Luzon force was not in vain, as their determination brought their comrades from the South Luzon force a precious commodity, time. Early on December 28th, the 1st Regiment of the 1st Philippine Regular Division, protecting the north flank of the South Luzon force, abandoned their positions near Louisiana and began a 20 kilometers long march over the road running along the southern shore of Laguna de Bay to Los Banos, where they, on the evening of December 29th, dug in to prevent a Japanese advance to Manila from that direction, positioning themselves in a comfortable position to slip quickly around the lake and northward past Manila through San Fernando and ultimately to Bataan. Southward, the 51st Philippine Division was executing a steady retreat, suffering little losses while the Japanese pursued them closely. On the afternoon of December 27th, the Japanese reached the 51st Division's temporary refuge at Candelaria, and they began infiltrating and bypassing roadblocks set by the Filipinos, forcing them to abandon their positions and retire a few kilometers north towards Tiaong. There, on the high ground, at the terrain ideal for a prolonged stand, General Jones intended to make a determined effort to hold the line, with about 4 infantry battalions from the highly mixed-up units from the 52nd and 53rd Regiments, supported with field artillery, tanks, and self-propelled artillery. However, due to reports about the swift Japanese advance in the north on the evening of December 28th, MacArthur ordered General Jones to expedite his withdrawal and to get out of South Luzon as soon as possible, so despite elaborate preparations, no stand was made at Tiaong. Over the next few days, the South Luzon force had started hurriedly for Bataan, covered in their retreat by the recently established 2nd Philippine Division, scraped together from the constabulary, leaving Manila behind at the mercy of the Japanese, who had halted at Candelaria to consolidate and bring up more equipment and supplies that were being unloaded at Lamon Bay. At the daybreak of the last day of 1941, the first wave of the South Luzon force, along with thousands of refugees, began crossing 2 bridges near Calumpit at the last minute, as the Japanese were already dangerously closing in. Even though for days, intelligence reports piled up at the 14th Army's headquarters, all pointing out to the concentration of Philippine troops on Bataan, General Homer, despite being pretty convinced that the Philippine army would try to make a stand somewhere on the peninsula, had no other alternative but to carry out his orders strictly, focusing more on taking Manila than on destroying the American and Philippine forces scattered across Luzon. And now on his path stood Baliuag, held by the battered 91st Division, and behind it, the vital road junction at Plaridel, a doorway to Calumpit. To spearhead the advance of the 48th Division along Route 5 towards the Philippine capital, Homer dispatched the 7th Tank Regiment under Colonel Seinosuke Sonoda, assisted by a company of engineers tasked to repair roads and bridges across the streams along the way, naming this force after its commander, the Sonoda Detachment. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle line, determined to hold the line until the very last Filipino soldier crossed the Pampanga, MacArthur committed all of his available resources, placing them under the temporary command of General Jones, charged with the defense of Plaridel and Calumpit, while to relieve the exhausted 91st Division, he had called upon the 71st Division from the reserve in San Fernando, and for the mission of holding the road at Plaridel, he assigned the 51st Division's reserve, the 51st Infantry Regiment, still untested in combat, while the 192nd and 194 tank battalions served as a mobile reserve. In the early hours of December 31st, the Sonoda Detachment dashed forward, reaching the outskirts of Baliuag, just as the lead elements of the 71st Division came into the town to relieve the 91st Division. Backed by the artillery, the Filipino defenders held firm, and so after a brief and intense skirmish, the Japanese broke off the action and withdrew. The second attack, launched around noon, came at the worst possible moment, just when the 91st Division had already left their positions and headed for Bataan, leaving the elements of the 71st Division alone in the town. This move allowed the Japanese tanks to, without encountering much resistance, enter the eastern outskirts of Baliuag, where they halted to await infantry reinforcements before unleashing an all-out assault against the town. But to make matters worse, at the same time, following the prearranged plan, the 71st Division also began pulling out from Baliuag, and, since all subsequent efforts to stop the withdrawal of the 71st Division proved futile, at 3 p.m., while the main body of Sonoda's force was massing for an attack in front of Baliuag, Jones ordered 2 platoons of Company C from 192nd Tank Battalion to attack the Japanese concentration at the east end of the town. At about 5 p.m., covered by artillery fire, the tanks of Company C, led by Lieutenant William Gentry, moved out to the attack, and in a brief but wild tank-versus-tank action that followed in the narrow streets of Baliuag, the M3 Stuart tank demonstrated superiority over the Japanese Type 89 medium tanks, having knocked out 8 Japanese tanks without losing any. The defense of Baliuag held until 10 p.m., when General Jones ordered his men to pull back to Plaridel and then west across the Pampanga, and while the battle in town still raged, most of the South Luzon force was well on the way to Bataan, thus completing their nearly 250-kilometer-long withdrawal through rugged terrain from Lamon Bay to Calumpit. Even though they had inflicted no significant damage on the Japanese, their more crucial victory was their survival. With the first daylight of 1942, at about 5 in the morning on January 1st, the last covering units, a mixture of the South and North Luzon force, crossed the Pampanga at Calumpit, and 1 hour later, at 6:15 a.m., the charges were detonated, and the bridges have disappeared in a massive explosion. As the morning wore on, the Tanaka Detachment, the second half of the 2nd Formosa Regiment, reached Calumpit after advancing cautiously from Plaridel. At the same time, the rest of the Japanese force continued towards Manila. Throughout the day, the Tanaka Detachment made multiple, yet futile attempts to cross the swiftly flowing Pampanga River, and it would ultimately take them 2 more days to reach the river's western bank. However, the Philippine Army's withdrawal might have gone completely differently. Ever since December 30th, the officers of the 48th Division, eager to seize the opportunity and make a decisive blow to the retreating Philippine Army, urged that the bridges at Calumpit, by then heavily packed with dynamite charges for rapid demolition and protected by only 2 anti-aircraft gun batteries, to be bombed from the air and despite complete air superiority, the Japanese Air Force had made virtually no effort against the bridges, extremely vulnerable to air attack. Moreover, not only did the Japanese Air Force fail to undertake any action to destroy the bridges, but they did almost nothing to impede the march to Bataan by bombing the ideal target, a road packed with a stream of men and vehicles over which the tired soldiers had to travel to reach the peninsula. Meanwhile, the bulk of the American and Filipino forces had now reached San Fernando, completing the most complicated maneuver of the campaign thus far, withdrawal from both ends of Luzon, skillfully evading the Japanese pincer movement that threatened to cut them in half on the plain in front of Manila. And there, in relative safety, they could regroup for the last lap of their journey to Bataan, with their safety granted not only by the demolished bridges at Calumpit, but also the outstanding efforts of the 11th and 21st Divisions further north, where in the first hours of 1942, fueled by misplaced confidence, the Kano detachment began moving south from Tarlac towards Bamban. By then, however, the Filipino soldiers had already mastered the art of war, halting the first Japanese attack instantly and without many problems, mainly by a single infantry company, Company C, from the 23rd Regiment of the 21st Division, positioned on the high ground along the dry riverbed north of the Bamban River, from where they unleashed punishing fire on the leading elements of the Kano detachment mounted on bicycles, which have once again got caught in the open, suffering the same fate as 2 days before in front of Zaragoza, and afterwards, backed by artillery fire, they withstand several full-scale assaults mounted by the Kano detachment throughout the day. At about 4 p.m., the 9th Infantry Regiment and supporting troops moved forward to reinforce the Kano detachment, but despite suffering heavy losses, they failed to penetrate the 21st Division's line. Further east on their right flank, the 11th Division held the line firmly, successfully repelling wave after wave of small-scale assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese until nightfall, when both Philippine divisions broke contact and began yet another tactical retreat. The 21st Division pulled back, first in Angeles, then turned southwest to Porac, while the 11th proceeded towards San Fernando. This time, the Japanese pursued them much more cautiously, so it was not until 11:30 a.m. on December 2nd that the Kano detachment reached Angeles, taking the Clark airfield area along the way, while by that time the Philippine army had long gone, passing through once a bustling San Fernando that was now a chilling ghost town. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the Japanese entered the deserted town where the Tanaka detachment made contact with the Kano detachment, reuniting again the 2nd Formosa Regiment. As General Homer's forces advanced towards San Fernando, he, with great care, prepared for the imminent capture of Manila. By January 1st, the 48th Division and the 4th and 7th Tank Regiments stood less than 20 kilometers from Manila's northern outskirts, while simultaneously the 16th Division approached Manila Bay from the south to a point a mere 10 kilometers from the capital. However, Homer, wary of potential friendly fire incidents between his eager troops that moved toward each other, paused the advance to establish an operational boundary between the merging forces. Ultimately, the Pasig River, which flowed through the capital and into Manila Bay, was designated as this boundary, and at 5:45 p.m. on Friday, January 2nd, 1942, the Japanese entered Manila with a battalion from the 1st Formosa Regiment and 2 battalions from the 47th Infantry Regiment of the 48th Division, which entered the northern sector, and simultaneously, from the south, the 16th Reconnaissance and a battalion of the 20th Infantry Regiment also entered the capital, leaving to the rest of the division to secure the wrecked remains of Cavite Naval Base. Throughout the night, a continuous stream of trucks with new units poured into the city, and by morning, Manila was crowded with Japanese soldiers who swiftly took over the control of governmental buildings, striving to restore order. Even though, in January 1942, Manila was occupied without being destroyed, the city would nonetheless face a grim destiny. In a little over 3 years, the Philippine capital would become the scene of one of the most intense and heavy urban battles of the Second World War, and, unquestionably, the bloodiest city combat fought in the Pacific theater. During a month-long battle, Manila will face complete devastation that will obliterate centuries-old architectural and cultural heritage dating back to the city's founding, and will result in the deaths of at least 100,000 civilians and place Manila alongside Berlin and Warsaw as the most devastated capital cities of the entire war. With the occupation of Manila, General Homer had successfully accomplished the mission assigned by Imperial General Headquarters, but he could draw small comfort from this hollow triumph as MacArthur's forces remained largely intact. Despite his force suffering relatively modest casualties of 627 killed, 1,282 wounded, and 7 missing, Homer knew that in line with broader Japanese strategy, he would soon need to transfer his best unit, the 48th Division, along with most of his aviation to support the 16th Army's advance in the Dutch East Indies. On the other side, Americans and Filipinos, after finalizing their withdrawal, were now crowded into Bataan, where they dug in on positions behind the already established lines. During the withdrawal, MacArthur had lost about 13,000 men, with only a small portion of the men lost as battle casualties, but mainly due to the widespread desertion of Filipino soldiers who merely returned to their homes. And, as the occupation of Manila marked the end of the first chapter of the Philippine campaign, the curtain could now go up on the second act, as the stage was set for a far bloodier chapter, one of the most desperate and heroic stands of the Pacific War, the Battle of Bataan, in which the combined American and Filipino forces dug in determined to resist the Japanese advance and defend their last stronghold in the Philippines in a brutal fight that would become a symbol of Filipino and American resilience in the face of overwhelming odds.